Bartleby the Scrivener, A History of Wall Street, Herman Melville. I am a very old man. The nature of my employment for the last 30 years has brought me into more than ordinary contact with what would seem an interesting and somewhat singular a set of men of whom, to my knowledge, nothing has been written. I mean the law clerks or scribes. I have known many of them, both professionally and privately, and could relate, if I chose, many stories which would make good-humoured gentlemen smile and sentimental souls weep. But I shall dispense with the biographies of all the other scribes for a few passages in the life of Bartleby, who was one of the strangest scribes I ever saw or heard of. While of other law clerks I could write the whole life, of Bartleby nothing of the kind can be done. I believe that there is no material for a full and satisfactory biography of this man. It is an irreparable loss to literature. Bartleby was one of those beings about whom nothing can be ascertained except from the original sources, and in his case these are very scanty. What my own astonished eyes saw of Bartleby is all I know of him, except, indeed, a vague account which will appear hereafter. Before introducing the clerk, as he at first appeared to me, it may be proper to make some mention of myself, my servants, my business, my rooms and surroundings in general, for such a description is indispensable to a proper understanding of the principal character who is to be introduced. Imprimis, I am a man who from my youth has been imbued with the profound conviction that the easiest path in life is the best. Consequently, though I belong to a profession proverbially energetic and nervous, and sometimes even turbulent, I have never allowed anything of the kind to invade my peace. I am one of those unambitious lawyers who never address a jury, nor, in any way, attract public applause. But in the cool tranquility of a cozy retreat, they do business comfortably among bonds, mortgages, and the title deeds of rich men. All who know me consider me an eminently safe man. The late John Jacob Astor, a character not given to poetic enthusiasm, did not hesitate to declare that my first great point was prudence. My next, method. I do not say this from vanity, but simply record the fact that I have not been unemployed in my profession because of the late John Jacob Astor, a name which I own, I am fond of repeating, for it has a round, orbicular sound, and rings like gold. I freely add that I was not insensible to the good opinion of the late John Jacob Astor. Some time before the period at which this little story begins, my employments had been considerably increased. The good old office, now extinct in the state of New York of Master of Chancery, had been conferred upon me. It was not a very arduous office, but an agreeable one. I seldom lose my temper, much more seldom give way to dangerous indignation at injustices and outrages, but I must allow myself to be hasty here and declare that I consider the sudden and violent revocation of the office of Master in Chancery by the new Constitution as a premature act, since I had counted on a life lease of the profits, whereas I have received only those of a few years. But that is a detail. My rooms were on the upper floor at No. Wall Street. At one end they looked upon the white wall of the interior, of a spacious skylight which penetrated the building from top to bottom. This view might have been considered somewhat dull and lacking in what landscape painters call life. But if so, the view from the other end of my rooms offered at least a contrast, if nothing more. In that direction, my windows commanded an unobstructed view of an imposing brick wall, darkened by age and eternal shadow, a wall which needed no telescope to reveal its hidden beauties, but, for the benefit of all short-sighted spectators, was pushed back within 10 feet of the panes of my windows. Owing to the great height of the surrounding buildings, and my rooms being on the second floor, the interval between this wall and mine very much resembled a huge square cistern. At the time immediately preceding Bartleby's arrival, I had 2 copyists in my employ and a promising young man as an office boy. First, second, Nippers, third, Ginger Nut. These names may appear unusual in the directory. In fact, they were nicknames, mutually conferred upon each other by my 3 employees, and considered expressive of their respective persons or personalities. He was a short, stout Englishman, about my own age, that is, not far from 60. In the morning, one might say, his face had a beautiful rosy colour, but after midday, the meridian, his dinner hour, he glowed like a fireplace full of Christmas coals, and continued to burn, but as it were with a gradual decline, till 6 o'clock in the evening or thereabouts, after which I saw no more of the owner of the face which, reaching its meridian with the sun, seemed to set with it, to rise, culminate, and decline the next day with the same regularity and undiminished glory. There are many singular coincidences which I have known in the course of my life, and not the least of them was the fact that just when he was showing his brightest rays of sunshine in his red and radiant face, just at that critical moment, there began the period of the day when I considered his business capacities seriously impaired for the remainder of the 24 hours. Not that he was at all idle or averse to business at that moment, far from it. The problem was that he tended to be overly energetic. There was in him a strange, fiery, agitated and flighty recklessness of activity. He was reckless in dipping the quill into the inkwell. All your blots on my documents were left there after noon meridian. In a suit, he was not only reckless and sadly given to making smudges in the afternoon, but on some days he went further and was quite noisy. On these occasions, too, his face flamed with enlarged emblazonments, as if cannon coal had been heaped upon anthracite. He made an unpleasant noise with the chair, knocked over his litter-box. When repairing his pens, he impatiently broke them into pieces and threw them on the floor in a sudden fury. He rose and bent over the table, packing his papers in an unseemly manner, very sad to see in an old man like himself. However, as he was in many ways a very valuable person to me, and during the entire time before noon, Meridian was also the quickest and most constant person, getting a lot of work done with a style that was hard to match. For these reasons, I was willing to overlook his eccentricities, though I did occasionally scold him. I did this very delicately, however, because, though he was the most civilized, or rather the most mild and reverent of men in the morning, in the afternoon he was disposed, under provocation, to be a little rash with his tongue, indeed, insolent. Now, valuing your morning services as I do, and determined not to lose them, yet at the same time annoyed by his inflammatory manner after 12 o'clock, and being a peaceable man, and unwilling to draw unseemly answers from him for my remonstrances, I took it upon myself, one Saturday noon, he was always worse on Saturdays, to suggest to him very kindly that perhaps, now that he was getting older, he had better shorten his labours. In short, that he need not come to my rooms after 12 o'clock, but dinner being over, he had better go home to his own, and rest till tea time. But no, he persisted in his afternoon devotions. His countenance became intolerably fervent, while he oratorically assured me, gesturing with a long ruler across the room, that if his services in the morning were useful, how indispensable would they be in the afternoon. "Submissively, sir," I said on this occasion, "I consider myself your right-hand man. In the morning I merely arrange and deploy my columns, but in the afternoon I place myself at their head and gallantly attack the enemy, thus." And he struck a violent blow with the ruler. "But the stains, Turkey," I insinuated. "True, but submissively, sir, look at this hair. I'm getting old. Surely, sir, a stain or two in a hot afternoon is no severe warning against grey hair. Old age, even if it stains the page, is honourable. Submissively, sir, we are both getting old." This appeal to my sympathy was almost irresistible. At any rate, I saw that he would not come, so I decided to let him stay. resolving, however, to arrange for him to deal with my less important papers during the afternoon. Nippers, the second on my list, was a young man of about 25, mustachioed, pale, and generally somewhat piratical in appearance. I have always considered him the victim of two evil powers, ambition and indigestion. The ambition was evidenced by a certain impatience with the duties of a mere copyist, an unwarranted encroachment on strictly professional matters, such as the original drafting of legal documents. The indigestion seemed to be signalized by an occasional nervous irritability and a smiling irritability, causing the teeth to chatter audibly at errors made in copying, unnecessary curses hissed instead of spoken in the heat of work, and especially by a continual discontent with the height of the table at which he worked. Although he had a very ingenious mechanical turn, Nippers never succeeded in making the table fit him. He put chips under it, blocks of various kinds, pieces of cardboard, and finally went so far as to try to make a neat adjustment with end pieces of folded blotting paper. But no inventions helped. If, to relieve his back, he raised the top of the table at a sharp angle, right up towards his chin, and wrote there like a man using the steep roof of a Dutch house for a desk, then he declared that this stopped the circulation in his arms. If now he lowered the table to his waist and bent over it to write, then he felt a terrible pain in his back. In short, the truth was that Nippers did not know what he wanted, or if he wanted anything, it was to get rid of a desk altogether. Among the manifestations of his morbid ambition was the fondness he had for receiving visits from certain ambiguous-looking fellows in shabby coats, whom he called clients. I knew indeed that he was not only sometimes a neighborhood politician, but also occasionally did small business in the courts of justice, and was not unknown on the steps of the tombs. I have good reason to believe, however, that an individual who called on him in my rooms and whom he insisted with an air of superiority was his client, was nothing more than an unscrupulous fellow, and the supposed title deed a bill. But with all his faults and the annoyances he caused me, Nippers, like his countrymen, was a very useful man to me. He wrote in a neat, nimble hand, and when he chose, was not without gentlemanly bearing. Besides, he always dressed in a gentlemanly manner, and thus incidentally reflected credibility in my rooms. As for E, I took great pains to prevent him from being an object of reproach to me. His clothes were apt to look greasy and to smell of restaurants. He wore his trousers very loose and baggy in the summer. His coats were execrable. His hat was impossible to handle. But though the hat was a matter of indifference to me, since his natural civility and deference as a dependent Englishman always led him to take it off as soon as he entered the room, his coat was another matter. As to his coats, I argued with him, but without success. The truth was, I suppose, that a man of so little income could not afford to display so bright a face and so bright a coat at the same time. As Nippers once observed, his money went chiefly to red dye. One winter's day I presented him with a very respectable-looking coat of mine, a grey quilted coat, extremely warm, buttoned from the knee to the neck. I thought he would appreciate the favour and would lessen his rashness and impetuosity in the afternoons. But no, I truly believe that buttoning up in such a shaggy, blanket-like coat had a pernicious effect upon him, on the same principle that too much oats are bad for horses. In fact, just as a reckless, restless horse is said to feel his oats, so he felt his coat. It made him insolent. He was a man to whom prosperity hurt. Though I had my own conjectures about the self-indulgent habits of Mr. Nippers as regards him, I was quite convinced that, whatever his defects in other respects, he was at least a temperate young man. But indeed nature herself seemed to have been his vintner, and had endowed him at birth with a disposition so irritable like that of brandy that all subsequent drinking was unnecessary. When I consider how, amid the silence of my apartments, Nippers would sometimes rise impatiently from his seat and, bending over the table, throw out his arms, seize the whole table, move it, and shake it with a sinister, creaking motion upon the floor, as if the table had been a wicked, voluntary agent, intent on discomforting and irritating him. I plainly perceived that, to Nippers, brandy and water were altogether superfluous. It was fortunate for me that, owing to their peculiar cause, indigestion, Nippers's irritability and consequent nervousness were chiefly observed in the morning, while in the afternoon he was comparatively quiet. Thus, as his paroxysms only came on about noon, I never had to deal with his eccentricities at the same time. Their attacks were relieved like guards. When Nippers's was on, his was off, and vice versa. This was a good natural arrangement under the circumstances. Ginger Nut, the third on my list, was a lad of about 12 years of age. His father was a drayman, and it was his ambition to see his son in the bank instead of in a dray before he died. He therefore sent him to my office as a law student, messenger, janitor, and sweeper, at the rate of $1 a week. He had a small desk of his own, but he did not use it much. On inspection, the drawer displayed a great variety of shells of various kinds of nuts. Indeed, to this quick-witted young man, the whole noble science of law was contained in a nutshell. One of the least of Ginger Nut's duties, and one which he performed most readily, was his duty as supplier of cakes and apples to the Nippers. Copying legal documents being a proverbially dry and hoarse business, my two clerks used to moisten their mouths frequently with Spitzenbergs, which were available at the numerous stalls near the custom house and post office. Besides, they sent Ginger Nut very frequently to buy that peculiar cake, small, flat, round, and very spicy, which had given it its name. On a cold morning when business was slow, he would devour dozens of these cakes as if they were mere biscuits. Indeed, they sell them at 6 or 8 to a penny, the scraping of his pen mingling with the crunch of the crunchy particles in his mouth. Of all his afternoon mistakes and rash imprudences, one of them was to moisten a ginger nut between his lips and stick it to a mortgage as a seal. I almost dismissed him then, but he soothed me by making an oriental bow and saying, "With all submission, sir, it was generous of me to find you at the stationery shop on my account." Now my original business, that of a clerk and title hunter and a writer of hidden documents of all kinds, was considerably increased by the coming of the mastership. There was now plenty of work for clerks. Not only did I have to push the clerks who were already with me, but I needed additional help. In answer to my advertisement, a young man standing motionless one morning appeared on the threshold of my office, the door open, for it was summer. I can picture the figure now, palely elegant, pitifully respectable, incurably desolate. It was Bartleby. After a few words about his qualifications, I approached him, glad to have among my staff a man of so singularly serene an aspect that I thought he might act beneficially upon the fickle temper of Mr. and the impetuous temper of Mr. Nippers. I should have said before that folding doors of frosted glass divided my room into 2 parts, one of which was occupied by my clerks, the other by myself. These doors I opened or closed at my pleasure. I resolved to reserve a corner for Bartleby near the folding doors, but on my side, so that this quiet man might be easily reached should any trifling business require to be done. I placed his writing table near a small side window in that part of the room, a window which originally commanded a side view of certain yards and dirty bricks, but which, owing to subsequent construction, now commanded no view, though it afforded some light. Within a yard of the panes was a wall, and the light came from far above, between 2 tall buildings, as if from a very small aperture in a dome. Besides a satisfactory arrangement, I provided a high green screen which might shut Bartleby out. entirely from my view, but not from my voice, and thus, in a manner, privacy and society were united. I sat for a time in absolute silence, recovering my dazed faculties. It immediately occurred to me that my ears had deceived me, or that Bartleby had entirely misunderstood my meaning. I repeated my request in the clearest tone I could assume, but in an equally clear tone came the former answer, "I would rather not." At first, Bartleby wrote an extraordinary amount. As if starved for something to copy, he seemed to gorge himself on my documents. There was no pause for digestion. He worked day and night, copying by sunlight and candlelight. I should have been quite satisfied with his application had he been as cheerful and diligent, but he went on writing silently, palely, mechanically. It is, of course, an indispensable part of a scrivener's business to check the accuracy of his copy, word for word. When there are two or more scriveners in an office, they assist each other in this analysis, one reading the copy, the other holding the original. It is a very monotonous, tiresome, and lethargic task. I can easily imagine that, to some sanguine temperaments, it would be quite intolerable. For instance, I cannot believe that the impetuous poet Byron would gladly sit down with Bartleby to examine a legal document of, say, 500 pages, written in cursive and without handwriting. Occasionally, in the rush of business, I used to assist in collating some brief document myself by calling on nippers for the purpose. One of my objects in placing Bartleby so much at my disposal behind the screen was to avail myself of his services on such trivial occasions. It was on the third day, I believe, of his being with me, and before any necessity arose for examining his own writings, that being in a great hurry to conclude some little business which I had in hand, I called upon Bartleby abruptly. In my haste, and in the natural expectation of an immediate answer, I sat with my head bent over the original on the table, and my right hand stretched out somewhat nervously on one side with the copy, so that, as soon as it emerged from its hiding place, Bartleby might take it up and proceed with his work without the least delay. It was in this very position that I sat when I called to him, and stated briefly what I wished him to do, namely, to examine a little paper with me. Imagine my surprise, or rather my consternation, when, without leaving his privacy, Bartleby, in a voice singularly soft and firm, replied, "I would rather not." "I would rather not," he said. I looked at him steadily. His face was thin and composed, his grey eyes vaguely calm. Not a wrinkle of agitation disturbed him. Had there been the least uneasiness, anger, impatience, or impertinence in his manner? In other words, had there been anything ordinarily human in him, I should doubtless have sent him violently away from the place. But, as it was, I should have thought of carrying my plaster bust of Cicero out of doors. I stood looking at it for a while he continued with his own writing, and then sat down again at my desk. This is very strange, I thought. What was best to do? But my business pressed me forward. I resolved to forget the matter for the present, reserving it for my future leisure. So, calling Nippers from the other room, the paper was quickly examined. "I would rather not," I repeated, rising with great enthusiasm and striding across the room. "What do you mean? Are you dazzled? I want you to help me compare this sheet here. Take it." And I held it out to him. He gave me, briefly, to understand that, on that point, my judgment was correct. Yes, his decision was irreversible. A few days after, Bartleby had finished 4 large documents, quadruplicates of a week's deposition given before me in my High Court of Chancery. It became necessary to examine them. It was an important case, and great accuracy was imperative. When all was in order, I called Nippers and Gingernut from the next room, intending to place the 4 copies in the hands of my 4 clerks while I read the original. Accordingly, Nippers and Gingernut had already seated themselves in a row, each with his document in his hand, when I called Bartleby to join this interesting group. "Bartleby, hurry! I'm waiting!" I heard a slow scrape of his chair legs on the uncarpeted floor, and presently he appeared standing in the doorway of his hermitage. "What do you want?" he said softly. "The copies, the copies," I said hurriedly. "Let us look at them. There!" And I handed him the fourth quadruplicate. "I would rather not do that," he said, and disappeared softly behind the screen. For a few moments I was like a pillar of salt at the head of my column of seated clerks. Composing myself, I advanced to the screen and asked the reason for such extraordinary conduct. "Why do you refuse?" "I would rather not do that." With any other man, I would have flown into a terrible rage, despised another word, and driven him ignominiously from my presence. But there was something about Bartleby that not only strangely disarmed me, but touched and disconcerted me wonderfully. I began to argue with him. "These are your copies, which we are about to examine. It is a saving of labor to you, for a single examination will answer for your 4 proofs. It is common usage. Every copyist is obliged to help in examining his copy. Isn't that so? Don't you want to talk? Answer." "I would rather not," he replied in a flute-like tone. It seemed to me that as I addressed him, he carefully turned over every statement I made. He fully understood the meaning. He could not refute the irresistible conclusions, but at the same time, some overriding consideration led him to answer as he did. "Are you resolved, then, not to comply with my request? A request made in accordance with common usage and common sense. It is not uncommon that, when a man has been intimidated in an unprecedented and unreasonably violent manner, he begins to waver in his purest faith. He begins, as it were, to vaguely conjecture that, wonderful as it may be, all justice and all reason lie on the other side. Consequently, if there are any disinterested persons present, he looks to them for some reinforcement of his own wavering. Mind. Peru, I asked, what do you think of this? Am I not right? With submission, sir, he said in his mildest tone. I think so. Nippers, I said. What do you think of this? I think I ought to turn you out of the office. The discerning reader will here observe that it being morning, his answer is expressed in polite and quiet terms, but Nippers is in sullen terms, or to repeat a former phrase, Nippers' sullenness was on duty and's off duty. Ginger nut, said I, willing to obtain the slightest suffrage on my behalf. What do you think of that? I think, sir, he's a little mad, replied Ginger Nut with a smile. You have heard what they say, said I, turning to the screen. Come and do your duty. But he did not deign to answer. I pondered for a moment, in deep perplexity. But once more business hastened me. I resolved again to defer the consideration of this dilemma to my future leisure. With some difficulty, we managed to look through the papers without Bartleby, though. Every page or two, he respectfully relinquished his opinion that the proceeding was quite out of the ordinary, while Nippers, fidgeting in his chair with a dyspeptic nervousness, uttered occasional hissing curses through clenched teeth at the stubborn fool behind the screen, and for his part, this was the first and the last time he would ever do another man's work without pay. Meanwhile, Bartleby sat in his hermitage, oblivious to everything but his own peculiar business there. A few days passed, the clerk being engaged in another long piece of work. His remarkable conduct of late led me to regard him with caution. I observed that he never went to dinner. In fact, he never went anywhere. Hitherto, to my personal knowledge, I had never seen him out of my office. He was a perpetual sentinel in the corner. About 11 o'clock in the morning, however, I noticed Ginger Nut advancing towards the opening in Bartleby's screen, as if silently beckoning thither by a gesture invisible to me where I sat. The boy would then leave the office, jingling a few pennies, and reappear with a handful of ginger nuts, which he would deliver to the hermitage, receiving 2 of the cakes as a reward. He lives then on ginger, I thought. He never dines properly. He must be a vegetarian then, but no, He never eats even vegetables, but only ginger. My mind then wandered into reveries as to the probable effects on the human constitution of living exclusively on ginger. Ginger is so called because it contains ginger as one of its peculiar constituents and the ultimate flavoring. Now, what was ginger? A pungent, peppery thing. Was Bartleby pungent and peppery? Not at all. Ginger then had no effect on Bartleby. He probably wished it had none. Nothing so irritates a serious person as passive resistance. If the individual resisted be not inhuman, and the resistor be perfectly harmless in his passivity, then, in the better humour of the former, he will charitably endeavour to interpret to his imagination what appears impossible to be resolved by his judgment. Yet for the most part I considered Bartleby and his manners. Poor fellow, I thought, he means no ill. He certainly does not mean to be insolent. His appearance sufficiently evinces that his eccentricities are involuntary. He is useful to me. I can get on well with him. If I reject him, the chances are he will approach some less indulgent employer and then be rudely treated, and perhaps miserably driven out to starve. Yes, here I can buy cheap a delicious self-approval. To be Bartleby's friend, to please him, in his strange obstinacy, will cost me little or nothing, while I gather in my soul what will prove a sweet morsel to my conscience. But this state of mind was not invariable with me. Bartleby's passivity sometimes irritated me. I felt strangely urged to meet him in fresh opposition, to draw from him some spark of anger that would answer my own. But in truth, I might as well have tried to set fire to a piece of Windsor soap with my knuckles. But one afternoon, the evil impulse in me got the better of me, and the following little scene ensued. "Bartleby," I said, "when all these papers are copied, I will compare them with you." "I would rather not." "What? Surely you do not intend to persist in this stubborn whim?" No answer. I opened the folding doors nearby and, turning to Nippers, exclaimed excitedly, "He says for the second time that he will not examine the papers. What do you think of that, Turkey?" It was late, remember. Turkey was sitting, shining like a brass kettle, with his bald head smoking and his hands fiddling with the stained papers. "Excuse me, sir, that is your business. I think his conduct is very unusual, and indeed unjust, towards Turkey and myself. But it may be only a passing fancy." "Ah," I cried, "you have strangely changed your mind then. You speak very kindly of him now." "Think of it," he roared. "I think I'll get behind his screen and blacken his eyes." So saying, he rose and threw out his arms in a pugilist's position. He was hastening to fulfill his promise when I stopped him, alarmed at the effect of inadvertently awakening the combativeness of his after-dinner. "Sit down," I said, "and hear what Nippers has to say. What do you think, Nippers? Would I not be justified in dismissing Bartleby at once?" "Only beer," he cried. "Kindness is the effect of beer. Nippers and I dined together today. You see how kind I am, sir. Shall I go and give him a blow?" "You mean Bartleby, I suppose." "No, not today, Turkey," I replied. "Please raise your fists." I closed the doors and resumed my advance towards Bartleby. I felt additional incentives tempting me to my fate. I longed to be the target of rebellion again. I remembered that Bartleby never left the office. "Bartleby," I said, "Ginger Nut is out. Call at the post office, will you? It was only a 3-minute walk, and see if there's anything for me." "I'd rather not." "You won't?" "I'd rather not." I staggered to my desk and sat there in deep meditation. My inveterate blindness returned. Was there anything else that would make me feel ignominiously repulsed by this thin, penniless fellow, my hired clerk? What other perfectly reasonable thing would he surely refuse to do? "Bartleby." No answer. "Bartleby," in a louder tone. No answer. "Bartleby!" I roared, like a ghost according to the laws of magical invocation, at the third. "Summons!" He appeared at the entrance to his hermitage. "Go into the next room and tell Nippers to come to me." "I'd rather not," he said respectfully and slowly, and softly disappeared. "Very well, Bartleby," said I in a calm, composed and severe tone, but controlled, and with an unalterable purpose of some terrible retribution very near. At the time I half intended something of the kind, but on the whole, as it was nearing my dinner time, I thought it best to put on my hat and walk home, suffering much from perplexity and anguish of mind. Shall I acknowledge it? The conclusion of this whole affair was that it soon became a fixed fact in my rooms that a pale young clerk named Bartleby, with a desk there, copied for me at the usual rate of 4 pence per folio, 100 words, but that he was permanently exempted from examining the work done by him, which duty was devolved upon Mr. and Mrs. Nippers, a compliment, no doubt, to his superior acumen. Besides, that the said Bartleby would never on any account be sent on the most trivial task, and that, even if requested to undertake such a task, it was generally understood that he would prefer not to do it. In other words, that he would flatly refuse. As the days went on, I became considerably reconciled to Bartleby, his steadiness, his freedom from all dissipation, his incessant activity, except when he resolved to sink into a permanent reverie behind the screen, his great quietness, his unalterable demeanor under all circumstances, made him a valuable acquisition. One important thing was this: he was always there, first in the morning, continually during the day, and last at night. I had a singular confidence in his honesty. I felt my most precious documents perfectly safe in his hands. Sometimes, to be honest, I could not for the life of me help falling into sudden and spasmodic passions with him, for it was extremely difficult to keep in mind all the time those strange peculiarities, privileges, and unheard-of exemptions which formed the tacit stipulations on Bartleby's part under which he remained in my office. Now and then, in my eagerness to settle some urgent business, I would inadvertently call upon Bartleby in a short, quick tone to put my finger, as it were, on the incipient knot of a red ribbon with which I was about to bind some papers. Of course, from behind the screen, the usual answer, "I would rather not," would certainly come. And then how could a human creature with the common infirmities of our nature refrain from exclaiming bitterly over such wickedness, such unreasonableness? Yet every additional rebuff of this kind which I received only tended to lessen the probability of my repeating the oversight. Here it must be said that, according to the custom of most lawyers who occupy offices in densely populated law buildings, there were several keys to my door. One of these was kept by a woman who lived in the attic, who scrubbed it weekly and swept and dusted it daily. Another was kept by Guy for convenience. The third I sometimes carried in my pocket. The fourth I did not know who had. Now, one Sunday morning, I happened to go to Trinity Church to hear a famous preacher, and, being there quite early, I thought I would wander back to my lodgings for a while. Luckily, I had my key with me, but on putting it into the lock, I found it locked by something inserted from within. Quite surprised, I cried out, when to my consternation a key was turned from within, and turning his thin face towards me and holding the door ajar, the apparition of Bartleby appeared, in his shirt-sleeves, and otherwise in a strangely ragged manner, saying in a low voice that he was sorry, but that he was deeply engaged at the moment, and would rather not see me at present. In a few words, he added, that perhaps I had better walk 2 or 3 times round the block, and by that time he would probably have finished his business. Now, the totally unexpected appearance of Bartleby, occupying my office on a Sunday morning, with his cadaverous and gentlemanly indifference, yet firm and composed, had so strange an effect upon me that I immediately crept away from my own door and did as I wished. But not without several pangs of helpless rebellion against the mild affront of that inexplicable clerk. Indeed, it was chiefly his wonderful mildness that not only disarmed me, but, as it were, unhinged me. For I consider that one is, for the moment, somewhat unhinged, who quietly allows his clerk to dictate to him and order him out of his own premises. Besides, I was very uneasy as to what Bartleby could be doing in my office in his shirt-sleeves, and in such a state of disorder as that of a Sunday morning. Was there anything wrong? No, that was out of the question. It was not to be thought for a moment that Bartleby was an immoral person. But what was he doing there? Copying. No, whatever his eccentricities, Bartleby was an eminently decorous person. He would be the last man to sit at his table in any state approaching nudity. Besides, it was Sunday, and there was something in Bartleby that forbade the supposition that he would violate the rules of the day by any secular occupation. Yet my mind would not be quieted, and filled with restless curiosity, I at length returned to the door. Without hindrance, I inserted my key, unlocked it, and entered. Bartleby was nowhere to be seen. I looked round anxiously and peered behind his screen, but it was evident that he was gone. On examining the place more closely, I gathered that for an indefinite period Bartleby must have eaten, dressed, and slept in my study, and that too without plate, mirror, or bed. The cushioned seat of a rickety old sofa in the corner bore the faint impression of a lean, reclining figure. Curled under its table, I found a blanket. Under the empty fireplace, a box of polish and a brush. On a chair, a tin basin with soap and a ragged towel. On a newspaper, a few crumbs of ginger and a piece of cheese. Yes, I thought, it is evident that Bartleby has settled here, keeping his single room alone. Then at once the thought struck me. What a miserable friendlessness and loneliness there is here. His poverty is great, but his solitude, how horrible. Think of it. On Sundays, Wall Street is deserted as Petra, and every evening of every day it is a void. This building, too, which during the week is teeming with work and life, at nightfall echoes with sheer vacancy, and all Sunday is desolate. And here Bartleby makes his home, sole spectator of a solitude which he saw so populous, a sort of innocent and transformed Marius, meditating among the ruins of Carthage. For the first time in my life, a feeling of overwhelming and poignant melancholy came over me. Before, I had never experienced anything but a not unpleasant sadness. The bond of common humanity now drew me irresistibly to melancholy, a fraternal melancholy, for both Bartleby and I were children of Adam. I remembered the bright silks and bright faces I had seen that day, in their evening gowns, sailing like swans down the Mississippi of Broadway, and I compared them with the pale copyist, and thought to myself, happiness courts the light, so we think the world is cheerful. But misery lurks at a distance, so we think there is no misery. These sad fancies, the chimeras no doubt of a sick and foolish brain, led to other and more peculiar thoughts concerning Bartleby's eccentricities. Presentiments of strange discoveries hovered about me. The pale figure of the clerk seemed, to me, stretched out among indifferent strangers in his trembling, winding robe. Suddenly I was attracted by Bartleby's closed desk, with the key lying in the lock in plain sight. I mean no wrong, seek no gratification of any senseless curiosity, I thought. Besides, the desk is mine, and its contents too, so I will venture to look inside. Everything was neatly arranged, the papers carefully arranged. The compartments were deep, and removing the file cases, I groped in their recesses. Presently, I felt something there and pulled it out. It was an old bandana handkerchief, heavy and knotted. I opened it and saw that it was a savings bank. Now I remembered all the silent mysteries I had noticed in this man. I remembered that he never spoke, except to answer, that, though at intervals he had considerable time to himself, I had never seen him reading, no, not even a newspaper, that for long periods he would stare out of his pale window behind the screen at the lifeless brick wall. I was sure that he never visited any dining room or restaurant, while his pale face plainly indicated that he never drank beer like, or even tea and coffee like, other men. That he never went anywhere in particular that I could know of, never went out for walks unless it happened at the time, that he refused to say who he was or where he came from, or whether he had any relations in the world. That, though so thin and pale, he never complained of ill health. And more than all, I remembered a certain unconscious air of pallor, what shall I call it? Of pale hauteur, let us say, or rather of austere reserve about him, which impressed me positively in my submissive obedience to his eccentricities, when I feared to ask him to do the least incidental thing for me, though I knew, by his long and continued stillness, that behind his screen he must be in one of his dead-wall reveries. Considering all this and uniting it with the fact, lately discovered, that he made my study his home and constant abode, and did not forget his morbid ill-humour, considering all this, a feeling of caution began to come over me. My first emotions were those of pure melancholy and the most sincere pity, but in proportion as Bartleby's helplessness grew more and more in my imagination, that melancholy melted into fear, that pity into repulsion. So true and so terrible that up to a certain point the thought or sight of misery excites our best affections. But in certain special cases beyond that point it does not. They are mistaken that this is invariably due to the inherent selfishness of the human heart. It proceeds, rather, from a certain hopelessness of remedying an excessive and organic evil. To a being of feeling, pity is not unfrequently pain, and when at last it is seen that such pity cannot effect any effectual relief, common sense commands the soul to be rid of it. What I saw that morning convinced me that the clerk was the victim of an innate and incurable disease. I could give alms to his body, but his body did not ache. It was his soul that ached, and his soul I could not reach. I could not accomplish the purpose of going to Trinity Church that morning. Somehow, the things I had seen disqualified me from going to church at that time. I walked home, thinking what I should do with Bartleby. At last I resolved upon this. I would ask him some quiet questions the next morning as to his history, etc., and if he refused to answer them openly and without reserve, and I supposed he would prefer not to do so, then I would give him a $20 bill more than I owed him, and tell him that his services were no longer required, but that if I could help him in any other way I should be glad to do so, especially if he wished to return to his native land. Wherever that might be, I should gladly assist him to defray the expenses. Besides, if after his arrival home he should at any time feel in need of assistance, a letter from him would certainly give him an answer. The next morning came. "Bartleby," I said, calling to him gently from behind the screen. No answer. "Bartleby," I said, in a still gentler tone, "come here. I am not going to ask you to do anything you would rather not do. I simply want to talk to you." With that, he silently appeared. "Will you tell me, Bartleby, where you were born?" "I would rather not." "Can you tell me anything about yourself?" "I would rather not." "But what reasonable objection have you to talking to me? I feel friendly to you." He did not look at me while I spoke, but kept his gaze fixed on my bust of Cicero, which, as I sat, stood directly behind me, about 6 inches above my head. "What is your answer, Bartleby?" I asked, after waiting a considerable time for an answer, during which his countenance remained motionless, with only the slightest conceivable tremor in the white, attenuated mouth. "Then you understand it too," I said, a little cheerfully. "At present I prefer not to give any answer," he said, and retired to his hermitage. "I confess it was a bit weak of me, but your attitude on that occasion irritated me. Not only did there seem to be a certain calm disdain in him, but his perversity seemed ungrateful, considering the undeniable good treatment and indulgence he had received from me. Once more I sat ruminating what I should do, mortified as I was at his behavior, and resolved as I was to dismiss him on entering my offices. Yet, strangely enough, I felt something superstitious beating at my heart, forbidding me to carry out my purpose, and denouncing me as a villain if I dared to utter a bitter word against the most desolate of people. At length, familiarly drawing my chair back behind his screen, I sat down and said, "Bartleby, do not trouble yourself to reveal your story, but let me beg, as a friend, to conform, as far as possible, to the customs of this office. Say now that you will help to look over the papers tomorrow or the day after. In short, say now that in a day or two you will begin to be a little reasonable. Say, Bartleby." "I prefer not to be a little reasonable at present," was his slightly cadaverous reply. At this moment the folding doors opened and Nippers approached. He seemed to be suffering from an unusually bad night's sleep, caused by a more severe indigestion than usual. He heard Bartleby's last words. "I'd rather not, eh?" growled Nippers. "I'd rather, if I were you," addressing himself to me. I'd rather give him the preference, the stubborn mule. What is it, sir, pray, that he'd rather not do now?" Bartleby did not move a limb. "Mr. Nippers," said I, "I'd rather you'd retire for the present." Somehow of late I had grown accustomed to using the word prefer involuntarily on all sorts of not exactly proper occasions, and I shuddered to think that my contact with the clerk had already seriously affected me mentally, and what still greater and deeper aberration could it not produce? This apprehension had not failed to prompt me to have recourse to summary means. As Nippers, looking very sour and cross, was leaving, he came up to me in a mild and deferential manner. "Submissively, sir," said he, "I was thinking of Bartleby here yesterday, and I think if he would rather have a pint of good ale every day, it would greatly help him to recover and enable him to help in looking over his papers." "Submissively, what word, sir?" he asked, snuggling respectfully into the narrow space behind the screen, and thereby making me push the clerk aside. "What word, sir?" "I would rather be alone here," said Bartleby, as if he were offended at being hemmed in his privacy. "That's the word, Turkey," said I, "that's it." "Oh, rather. Oh, yes, a strange word. I never use it myself. But, sir, as I was saying, if he would only—" "Turkey," I interrupted, "please, retire." "Of course. Sir, if you prefer me to do it." As he opened the folding door to retire, Nippers, at his desk, caught a glimpse of me and asked me whether I would prefer a particular piece of work to be copied on blue or white paper. He gave no malicious emphasis to the word prefer. It was evident that it rolled involuntarily off his tongue. I thought to myself, I must certainly get rid of a madman who has already caused me some inconvenience, if not to myself and the clerks. But I thought it prudent not to interrupt the dismissal immediately. The next day I noticed that Bartleby did nothing but sit at the window in his dead-wall reverie. On my asking him why he did not write, he said he had made up his mind to write no more. "Why, how now?" "And now," I exclaimed, "not to write any more." "Not any more? And what is the reason?" "Don't you see the reason for it?" he replied indifferently. I looked at him steadily and perceived that his eyes seemed dull and glassy. It immediately occurred to me that his unprecedented diligence in copying by the dark window during the first weeks of his stay with me might have temporarily impaired his sight. I was moved. I said something to him in sympathy. I intimated that, of course, he had done well in refraining from writing for a time, and I urged him to take advantage of the opportunity of taking exercise in the open air. This, however, he did not do. A few days after, my other servants being absent and in a great hurry to get certain letters out by post, I thought that having nothing else to do, Bartleby would certainly be less inflexible than usual, and would take them to the post office, but he flatly refused, so, to my great annoyance, I went myself. More days passed. Whether Bartleby's eyes were better or not, I could not say. To all appearances I thought they were, but when I asked him if they were, he gave me no answer. At any rate, he would not copy. At last, in answer to my entreaties, he informed me that he had ceased copying forever. "What?" I exclaimed. "Suppose your eyes were quite better than ever. Would you not copy then?" "I have given up copying," he replied, and slid aside. He remained as ever a constant presence in my rooms. Nay, if that were possible, he became even more of a constant presence than before. What was to be done? He would do nothing in the office. Why should he remain there? In fact, he had become a millstone to me, not only useless as a necklace, but irksome to bear. Yet I pitied him. I speak less than the truth when I say that on his own account he caused me uneasiness. Had he named a single relative or friend, I should have written at once, and insisted on their removing the poor fellow to some suitable retreat. But he seemed alone, absolutely alone in the universe. A wreck in the middle of the Atlantic. Oh, length, the necessities connected with my business tyrannized over all other considerations. With the greatest decency possible, I told Bartleby that in 6 days he must leave the office unconditionally. I advised him to make arrangements, in the meantime, for another lodging. I offered to assist him in this undertaking if he would himself take the first step towards removal. "And when you finally leave me, Bartleby," I added, "I will see that you do not go away quite destitute. 6 days from this hour, remember." At the end of which time I peeped behind the screen, and lo, Bartleby was there. I buttoned up my coat, steadied myself, advanced slowly towards him, touched his shoulder and said, "The time has come. You must leave this place. I am sorry for you. Here is the money, but you must go." "I would rather not," he replied, still with his back to me. "You must." He remained silent. I had an unlimited confidence in the common honesty of this man. He had frequently returned to me sixpence and shillings that had been carelessly thrown on the floor, for I am apt to be very rash in such delicate matters. The proceeding which followed will not be considered extraordinary. "Bartleby," I said, "I owe you $12 on account. Here are 32. The remaining 20 is yours. Will you accept?" And I handed him the notes. But he made no movement. "I will leave them here then," placing them under a weight on the table. Then taking my hat and stick and going to the door, I turned quietly and added, "After you have cleared away your things from these offices, Bartleby, you will, of course, lock the door, as everyone has gone out except you, and please, put your key under the mat that I may get it tomorrow. I shall not see you again. So goodbye. If I can be of any use hereafter in your new residence, be sure to let me know by letter. Goodbye, Bartleby, and good luck." But he answered not a word. Like the last column of some ruined temple, he stood still, silent and lonely, in the middle of the deserted room. As I walked home in thought, my vanity got the better of my pen. I could not help flattering myself on my masterly skill in getting rid of Bartleby. Masterly, I should say, and so it must seem to any impartial thinker. The beauty of my procedure seemed to consist in its perfect calmness. There was no vulgar intimidation, no bravado of any kind, no angry browbeating, no pacing up and down the apartment, giving vehement orders to Bartleby to get rid of his miserable snares. Nothing of the sort. Without loudly ordering Bartleby to go away, as a lesser genius might have done, I assumed that he must go, and on this assumption I built all I had to say. The more I thought over my procedure, the more I delighted in it. Yet on waking next morning I had my doubts. I had somehow slept away the fumes of vanity. One of the quietest and wisest moments a man has is just after he wakes in the morning. My procedure seemed as shrewd as ever, but only in theory. How it would prove itself in practice, that was the trouble. It was indeed a fine idea to assume Bartleby's departure, but after all, that assumption was simply mine, and not Bartleby's. The great question was not whether I had assumed he would leave me, but whether he would prefer to do so. He was a man of preferences rather than of guesses. After breakfast, I walked about the town, discussing the probabilities of pros and cons. One moment I thought I would fail miserably, and that Bartleby would be found alive in my office, as usual. The next moment, I seemed certain to see his chair empty, and so I kept turning round. At the corner of Broadway and Canal Street, I saw a very lively group of people talking excitedly. "I'll bet you won't," said a voice as I passed. "Won't you?" "There," I said. "Invest your money." Instinctively, I was putting my hand into my pocket for mine when I remembered that it was election day. The words I had heard had no reference to Bartleby, but to the success or failure of some candidate for mayor. In my attentive frame of mind, I had, as it were, imagined that all Broadway shared my excitement and was debating the same question with me. I passed on, much thankful that the tumult of the street drowned my momentary distraction. As I had intended, I arrived earlier than usual at the door of my study. I stood and listened for a moment. All was silent. He must have gone. I tried the handle. The door was locked. Yes, my procedure had worked perfectly. He must indeed have disappeared, yet a certain melancholy mingled with it. I almost regretted my brilliant success. I was groping under the doormat for the key, which Bartleby must have left there for me, when accidentally my knee struck against a panel, making a ringing sound, and in answer, a voice came from within. "Not yet. I am engaged." It was Bartleby. I was astonished. For an instant I stood like the man who, with his pipe in his mouth, was killed by a summer bolt of lightning on a cloudless afternoon, long ago in Virginia. At his own warm, open window he was killed, and lay leaning out in the dreamy afternoon until someone touched him, and he fell. "It wasn't," I muttered at last, but obeying again that wonderful influence which the inscrutable clerk exercised over me, and from which, for all my irritation, I could not entirely escape, I went slowly downstairs and out into the street, and as I walked round the block, I considered what I should do next in the face of this unheard-of perplexity. I could not drive the man away with a real thrust. To drive him off by cursing him would do no good. To call the police was an unpleasant idea, and yet to allow him to enjoy his cadaverous triumph over me, that too I could not think of. What was to be done? Or, if nothing could be done, was there anything else that I could assume in the matter? Yes, just as before, I had assumed prospectively that Bartleby would go, so now I could assume retrospectively that he had gone. In the legitimate execution of this assumption, I could rush into my office and, pretending not to see Bartleby, walk towards him as if he were air. Such a proceeding would, in a singular degree, have the appearance of a sure blow. It was scarcely possible that Bartleby could resist such an application of the doctrine of suppositions, but on reflection, the success of the plan seemed very doubtful. I resolved to discuss the matter with him again. "Bartleby," said I, entering the room. With a calm and stern expression, "I am seriously displeased. I am hurt, Bartleby. I had thought better of you. I had supposed you to be so gentlemanly an organization that in any delicate dilemma a slight suggestion would have sufficed. In short, a supposition. But it seems I am mistaken. Why," I added, startling without affectation, "you have not touched that money yet," pointing to it just where I had left it the night before. He made no reply. "Are you going to leave me or not?" I asked with sudden fury, approaching him. "I would rather not leave you," he replied, gently emphasizing the no. "What right have you to stay here? Do you pay rent? Do you pay my taxes? Or is this your property?" He made no answer. "Are you ready to go on writing now? Are your eyes recovered? Will you copy a little article for me this morning, or help me to look over a few lines, or call at the post office? In short, will you do anything to give a special touch to your refusal to leave the premises?" He silently retired to his hermitage. I was now in such a state of nervous resentment that I thought it prudent to refrain from making any further demonstrations. Bartleby and I were alone. I remembered the tragedy of the unfortunate Adams and the still more unfortunate Colt in the latter's lonely study, and how poor Colt, terribly irritated by Adams and rashly carried away by excitement, was suddenly led to commit his fatal act, an act which no one could surely deplore more than the author himself. It has often occurred to me in my reflections on the subject that if the altercation had taken place in the public street or in a private house, it would not have ended as it did. It was the circumstance of being alone in a lonely upstairs study in a building utterly devoid of humanizing domestic associations, an uncarpeted office, no doubt, of a dusty and worn appearance, that must have contributed much to increase the irritable despair of the unfortunate Colt. But when that old Adam of resentment rose up in me and tempted me towards Bartleby, I seized him and threw him. How? Why, simply by remembering the divine injunction, "A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another." Yes, that was what saved me. Besides higher considerations, charity often operates as a vastly wise and prudent principle, a great safeguard to those who possess it. Men have committed murder from jealousy, anger, hatred, selfishness, and spiritual pride, but no man that I have ever heard of has ever committed a fiendish murder from pure charity. Mere self-interest, then, if no better motive can be found, ought, especially in men of quick temper, to incite all beings to charity and philanthropy. At any rate, on the occasion in question, I endeavored to drown my exasperated feelings towards the clerk by interpreting his conduct with benevolence. Poor fellow, poor fellow! I thought he meant nothing, and besides, he had fallen on hard times and ought to be pampered. I endeavored also to occupy myself immediately, and at the same time to comfort my dejection. I tried to imagine that, in the course of the morning, at an hour agreeable to him, Bartleby would, of his own free will, leave his hermitage and take a determined line of march towards the door. But no. 12:30 came. He began to blush, overturned his inkstand, and became generally boisterous. Nippers settled down into polite silence. Ginger Nut munched her midday apple, and Bartleby remained standing at his window in one of his deepest dead-wall reveries. Will this be credited? Shall I acknowledge him? That afternoon I left the office without saying another word to him. Some days passed, during which, at intervals of leisure, I glanced over Edwards on the Will and Priestley on Necessity. Under these circumstances, these books induced a salutary sensation in me. I gradually became convinced that these troubles of mine with the clerk had been predestined from eternity, and that Bartleby had lodged in me by some mysterious purpose of an all-wise providence, which it was not for a mere mortal like me to comprehend. Yes, Bartleby, stay behind your screen, I thought. I will not pursue you any further. You are as harmless and silent as any of these old chairs. In short, I never feel so private as when I know you are here. At last I see, I feel, I penetrate the predestined purpose of my life. I am content. Others may have higher parts to play, but my mission in this world, Bartleby, is to furnish you with an office space for as long as you find it necessary to remain. I believe this wise and blessed state of mind would have remained with me had it not been for the unsolicited and uncharitable comments which my professional friends have imposed upon me. But it often happens that the constant friction of illiberal minds wears away the best resolutions of the most generous. Though, of course, when I reflected on it, it was not strange that people who came into my office should be struck with the peculiar aspect of the inexplicable Bartleby, and should therefore try to make some sinister observations about him. Sometimes a lawyer on business with me, who came to my office and found no one there but the clerk, would try to get some precise information from him as to my whereabouts, but without paying any attention to their idle chatter, Bartleby remained motionless in the middle of the room. So, after contemplating him in that position for a while, the lawyer left as wise as he had arrived. Besides, when a hearing was in progress and the room filled with lawyers, witnesses, and business was rapidly progressing, Some gentlemen of the law present, deeply occupied seeing Bartleby quite unemployed, would request him to run to the gentleman of the law, office and bring him some papers. Bartleby would then quietly refuse, but remain as idle as before. Then the lawyer would cast a sharp look and turn to me, and what could I say? At length I perceived that, throughout my circle of professional acquaintances, there was a rumor of admiration circulating, respecting the strange creature I kept in my office. This worried me greatly, and as the idea occurred to me that he might possibly grow to be a long-lived man and continue to occupy my rooms, denying my authority, perplexing my visitors, scandalizing my professional reputation, and casting a general gloom over the place, keeping body and soul together to the last by his savings, for doubtless he spent but halfpenny a day, and in the end, perhaps outliving me and claiming the possession of my office by right of its perpetual occupancy. As all these gloomy expectations came upon me more and more, and my friends continually intruded with their relentless remarks upon the apparition in my room, a great change came over me. I resolved to collect all my faculties and to rid myself forever of this intolerable incubus. Before forming any complex project, however, adapted to this end, I first simply suggested to Bartleby the advisability of his final departure. In a calm and serious tone, I recommended the idea to his careful and mature consideration. But after 3 days' consideration of the subject, he informed me that his original determination remained the same. In short, that he still preferred to remain with me. "What shall I do?" I said to myself, buttoning up my coat to the last button. "What shall I do? What shall I do? What does conscience tell me I should do with this man, or rather with this ghost? Get rid of him I must, he will. But how? Will you not turn him out, the poor, pale, passive mortal? Will you not turn so helpless a creature from your door? Will you not dishonor yourself by such cruelty? No, I will not, I cannot do it. I would rather let him live and die here, and then carve his remains into the wall. What will you do then? In spite of all your persuasions, he will not budge. Bribes he leaves under his own paperweight on his desk. In short, it is quite clear that he prefers to cling to you. Then something severe, something unusual must be done. What? Surely you will not have him arrested by a constable and send his innocent paleness to the common jail. And on what grounds would you get such a thing done? A vagabond, is he? What, is he a vagabond, a wanderer who refuses to yield? It is because he does not want to be a vagabond, then, that you try to make him a vagabond. That is too absurd. No visible means of support. There it is. Wrong again, for undoubtedly he supports himself, and that is the only irrefutable proof any man can produce that he has the means of doing so. Enough of that. Since he will not leave me, I must leave him. I will change my office. I will remove to another place, and I will give him advance notice that if I find him in my new premises, I will prosecute him as a common trespasser. Acting accordingly, the next day I addressed him as follows. I think these rooms are too far from the town hall. The air is unwholesome. In short, I propose to change my office next week, and I shall have no further need of your services. I tell you this now, that you may look for another place. He made no reply, and nothing more was said. On the appointed day, I hired carts and men, and repaired to my rooms, and having but little furniture, was removed in a few hours. All the time the clerk had stood behind the screen, which I had ordered to be removed last. It was taken down, and being folded up like a huge folio, left him the immobile occupant of an empty room. I stood in the doorway watching him for a moment, while something within me rebuked me. I went in again, with my hand in my pocket, and my heart in my mouth. Goodbye, Bartleby, I'm going. Goodbye, and may God bless you in some way. And take this, slipping something into his hand. But it fell to the floor, and then, strange to say, I turned away from him whom I had so longed to be rid of. "I am sorry, sir," said I with pretended tranquillity, but with an inward trembling. "But in truth, The man you allude to means nothing to me. He is neither my relation nor my apprentice, for you to hold me responsible for him. In mercy's sake, who is he? I certainly cannot tell you. I know nothing about him. I formerly employed him as a copyist, but he has done nothing for me for some time. Then I will do him good morning, sir. Several days passed, and I heard no more, and though I often felt a charitable impulse to go to the place and see poor Bartleby, yet a certain scruple of I know not what restrained me. It was all over with him by this time, I thought at last, when, for another week, no further information reached me. But on reaching my room the next day, I found several persons waiting at my door in a state of extreme nervous excitement. "That's the man, here he comes," shouted the one in front, whom I recognized as the lawyer who had previously visited me alone. "You must take him away at once," cried a large man among them, advancing towards me, whom I knew to be the landlord of number 1, Wall Street. "These gentlemen, my tenants, can't stand it any longer. Mr. B," pointing to the lawyer, "has turned him out of his room, and he now persists in haunting the building, sitting on the banisters by day and sleeping in the hall at night. Everyone is worried. Clients are leaving their offices. Some fear a mob, something you must do, and that without delay." Horrified at this torrent, I recoiled from it and willingly shut myself up in my new lodgings. In vain did I insist that Bartleby meant nothing to me, no more than to any other person. In vain. I was the last person known to have had any contact with him, and they held me responsible for this dreadful situation. Fearing now of being exposed in the newspapers, as one person present had obscurely threatened, I considered the matter, and at last said that if the lawyer would grant me a confidential interview with the clerk, in his own room, the lawyer's, I would do my utmost that afternoon to relieve them of the inconvenience of which they complained. Ascending the stairs to my old haunt, there sat Bartleby, silently sitting on the banister of the landing. "What are you doing here, Bartleby?" I said. "Sitting on the banister," he replied softly. I motioned him to the lawyer's room, who then left us. "Bartleby," I said, "are you aware that you are the cause of great trouble to me by persisting in occupying the hall after you have been dismissed from the office?" No answer. "Now, one of two things must happen. Either you do something, or someone else does something with you. Now, what kind of business would you like to engage in? Would you like to go back to copying for someone?" "No, I prefer not to make any changes." "Would you like an apprenticeship in a draper's shop? There's too much confinement in it." "No, I wouldn't like an apprenticeship, but I'm not picky." "Too much confinement," I cried. "Why do you keep yourself confined all the time?" "I'd rather not take an apprenticeship," he replied, as if he wanted to settle that little problem at once. "What would the bartending business be like for you? There's no harm in doing that." "I wouldn't like it at all, though. As I said before, I'm not picky." His unusual verbosity inspired me. I resumed my charge. "Well then, would you like to travel around the country collecting bills for merchants? It would improve your health." "No, I'd rather be doing something else." "Then how would it be to go as a chaperone to Europe, to entertain some young gentleman with your conversation? How would that please you?" "Not at all. I don't think there's anything definite about it. I like to sit still. But I'm not picky." "Then you'll sit still," I cried, losing my temper, and for the first time in all my exasperating association with him, nearly bursting with rage. "If you do not leave this place before evening, I shall feel myself obliged. Indeed, I am obliged to leave this place myself." I concluded somewhat absurdly, at a loss to know by what threats I might attempt to frighten his immobility into obedience. Despairing of any further exertions, I was leaving him hurriedly when a last thought occurred to me, one that had not been entirely ignored before. "Bartleby," said I, in the gentlest tone I could assume under such exciting circumstances, "will you go home with me now? Not to my office, but to my residence, and remain there until we can make some arrangement convenient for you in our leisure? Come, let us begin at once. No, I prefer not to make any alteration at present. I made no reply, but eluding them all with the rapidity of my flight, I rushed out of the building, ran down Wall Street towards Broadway, and leaping into the first omnibus, soon got away from the pursuit. As soon as tranquility returned, I distinctly perceived that I had done all I could, both in regard to the demands of the landlord and his tenants, and in regard to my own desire and sense of duty to benefit Bartleby and protect him from rude persecution. I endeavored to be entirely unconcerned and easygoing, and my conscience justified me in the attempt, though indeed it was not so successful as I could have wished. So fearful was I of being again pursued by the infuriated landlord and his exasperated tenants that, turning over my business to nippers, I for a few days traversed the upper part of the city and the suburbs in my rockaway, crossed to Jersey City and Hoboken, and paid fleeting visits to Manhattanville and Astoria. Indeed, I almost lived in my rockaway back then. When I re-entered my study, behold, a note from the landlord was lying on the table. I opened it with trembling hands. It informed me that the author of the note had sent for the police and had Bartleby removed to the Tombs as a vagabond, and, as I knew more about him than any other person, he desired me to appear at that place and give a proper account of the facts. This news had a mixed effect upon me. At first I was indignant, but at last I almost approved. The landlord's energetic and summary disposition had led him to adopt a course which I would not have decided upon myself, and yet, as a last resort under such peculiar circumstances, it seemed the only plan. As I afterwards discovered, the poor clerk, when told that he must be conducted to the Tombs, offered no objection, but with his pale, motionless manner, silently acquiesced. Some of the pitying and curious spectators joined the group, and led by one of the constables who was arm in arm with Bartleby, the silent procession made its way amidst the noise, heat, and gaiety of the noisy streets at noon. On the very day that I received the note, I went to the Tombs, or to be more precise, to the halls of justice. Seeking the proper officer, I stated the purpose of my visit, and was informed that the individual I had described was indeed there. I then assured the officer that Bartleby was a perfectly honest man, and very worthy of pity, though unaccountably eccentric. I told him all I knew, and concluded by suggesting the idea of allowing him to remain in as lenient a confinement as possible until something less severe could be done, though in truth I scarcely knew what. At any rate, if nothing further could be decided, the asylum must receive him. I then begged for an interview. Being under no disgraceful charge, and perfectly serene and harmless in all his ways, he was allowed to wander freely about the prison, especially in the enclosed and grassy yard. And so I found him there, standing alone in the quietest of all, the yards, with his face turned towards a high wall, while all around, through the narrow slits of the prison windows, I thought I saw the eyes of murderers and robbers watching him. "Bartleby? It was not I who brought you here, Bartleby," said I, deeply hurt by his implied suspicion. "And to you it ought not to be so vile a place. Nothing reproachful attaches to your being here, and you see, it is not such a dismal place as you might think. There is sky there, and here is grass." "I know where I am," he answered, but said no more, so I left him. As I re-entered the passage, a large burly man in an apron came up to me and, jerking his thumb over his shoulder, said, "Is that your friend?" "Yes." "Does he want to starve? If he does, let him live on prison food, that's all." "Who are you?" I asked, not knowing what to make of a person who spoke so informally in such a place. "I am the food man. Gentlemen who have friends here employ me to provide them with something nice to eat." "Is that so?" I asked, turning to the turnkey. He said yes. "Well," said I, thrusting some silver into the hands of the foodman, for so they called him. "I want you to pay special attention to my friend there. Let him have the best dinner he can, and you must be as polite to him as you can." "Will you introduce me, please?" said the grubman, looking at me with an expression that seemed to say he was impatient for an opportunity of giving me a specimen of his creation. Thinking it would be of benefit to the clerk, I agreed, and asking the cleaner his name, I went with him to Bartleby. "Bartleby, this is Mr. Cutlets. You will find him very useful." "Your servant, sir, your servant," said the man of the house, bowing gravely behind his apron. "I hope you are well here, sir. Spacious grounds, airy apartments, sir. I hope you will stay with us a little while. Try to make everything pleasant. May Mrs. Cutlets and I have the pleasure of your company at dinner, sir, in Mrs. Cutlets's private room." "I would rather not dine today," said Bartleby, turning round. "That would not please me. I am not accustomed to dinners." With that, he moved slowly to the other side of the room, and stood facing the wall without exit. "What is it like?" said the grubman, addressing me with a look of astonishment. "He is a queer one, isn't he?" "I think he's a little disturbed," said I sadly. "Mad, really mad. Well, I swear to God I thought that friend of yours was a forger. They are always pale and kind, these forgers. I don't pity them. I can't help it, sir. Did you know Munro Edwards?" he added touchingly, and paused. Then laying his hand compassionately on my shoulder, he sighed. "He died of consumption at Sing Sing. Did you not know Munro then?" "No, I have never had any social contact with a forger. But I can't stop any longer. Look at my friend there. You won't lose by it. I'll see him again. A few days after I got admission to the Tombs again, and walked the corridors in search of Bartleby, but I couldn't find him." "I saw him come out of his cell a little while ago," said a warder. "Perhaps he has gone to wander about the yards." So I went in that direction. "Are you looking for the silent man?" asked another warder who passed me. "There he is, sleeping in the yard. It is not 20 minutes since I saw him. Lying there." The yard was perfectly silent. It was not accessible to ordinary prisoners. The surrounding walls, of impressive thickness, shut out all sound behind them. The Egyptian character of the masonry weighed upon me with its gloom. But a soft, imprisoned turf grew beneath my feet. The heart of the eternal pyramids, it seemed, where, by some strange magic, through the cracks, grass seeds, dropped by birds, had sprouted. Huddled strangely at the base of the wall, with his knees drawn up and lying on his side, his head touching the cold stones, I saw the exhausted Bartleby. But nothing moved. I stopped. Then I approached him. I leaned over and saw that his bleary eyes were open. Otherwise he seemed fast asleep. Something prompted me to touch him. I felt his hand, and a shiver ran down my arm and down my spine to my feet. The round face of the grubman stared at me now. His dinner is ready. Is he not going to have dinner today too, or does he live without it? "Lives without dinner," I said, and closed my eyes. "Eh? He is asleep, is he?" "With kings and counsellors," I murmured. "There seems little need to pursue this story any further. Imagination will readily supply a scanty account of poor Bartleby's burial. But before I take my leave of the reader, let me say that if this little narrative has sufficiently interested him to awaken a curiosity as to who Bartleby was, and what manner of life he led before the present narrator met him, I can only reply that I fully share that curiosity, but am utterly incapable of satisfying it. However, here I hardly know whether I should divulge a little rumour which reached my ears a few months after the clerk's death. What it was based on, I have never been able to determine, and therefore how true it is I cannot now say. But as this vague account has not been without a certain strange and suggestive interest to me, sad as it is, it may prove the same to some others, and so I will mention it briefly. The story was as follows. Bartleby had been a subordinate clerk in the dead letter office at Washington, whence he had been suddenly removed by a change of administration. When I think about this rumour, I cannot adequately express the emotions that take hold of me. Dead letters, don't they sound like dead men? Imagine a man by nature and misfortune prone to pale despair. Can any activity seem more suitable for increasing it than continually handling these dead letters and sorting them out for the flames, because they are burned annually in carts? Sometimes, from the folded paper, the pale clerk takes out a ring. The finger for which it was intended, perhaps, is rotting in the grave. A banknote sent in quick charity. He whom it would relieve no longer eats or goes hungry. Forgiveness for those who died in despair. Hope for those who died without hope. Good news for those who died suffocated by unrelieved calamities. In life missions, these cards run to death. Ah, Bartleby, ah, humanity!
We have reached the end of this audiobook. The Virtual Books Publishing team thanks for your visit. If you liked our channel, please subscribe and share. Thank you.